Hello, my friends. Welcome to another fabulous episode of the Why Religion podcast. I am Anthony Sweat from the Department of Church History and Doctrine, and you are in for a great episode today. I am a Utah boy. I was raised in the Rocky Mountains and in the shadows of the everlasting hills, as my colleague Lloyd Newell famously says. And ever since I was a little boy, July 24th was a holiday where we celebrated the Latter-day Saint pioneer companies that made this their home and the headquarters of the church, settling in these valleys. As a kid, I couldn't quite tell the difference between the 4th of July and the 24th of July, if I'm being totally honest with you. They were both days off with parades and fireworks and American flags when people gathered together and had family barbecues. As I got a little bit older, it became clear that the 4th of July was a national holiday of independence, and the 24th of July was a local holiday of pioneer independence. Although many wave American flags on the 24th of July, the utter irony about it is that the pioneer saints were desperately trying to flee and become independent from the United States of America. After years of being persecuted, church leaders concluded that the existing U.S. government would not protect their civil and religious rights as a minority group, and the saints simply decided to flee the USA. The recently released Council of 50 Minutes from the Joseph Smith Papers reveals that by the time Joseph Smith and the saints had settled in Nauvoo, some really strong feelings toward the U.S. government had developed due to the saints' collective experiences over the past decade. The suspicion and hostility was not toward the principles of freedom or the U.S. Constitution that Joseph Smith's own revelations confirmed was inspired by God, but it was directed toward government officials and their ineptitude to uphold it. On March 11th of 1844, Joseph Smith and several leading elders formally organized as a Council of 50. And as William Clayton recounted, their goal, quote, was to establish a theocracy, end of quote, somewhere in Western North America, in Texas, Oregon, or the California territory. They referred to this as the kingdom, an independent commonwealth that was separate from the United States. After Joseph Smith's death in June of 1844, Brigham Young became the leader of the church and the head of the Council of 50, and they helped plan for the Latter-day Saint exodus, not just from Illinois, but from the U.S. as a whole. Brigham said to the council in May of 1845, quote, "When we go from here, we don't calculate to go under any government but the government of God," end of quote. Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat from BYU's Department of Church History and Doctrine was part of the Joseph Smith Papers team that published the Council of 50 Minutes. And he has also recently published an article for an academic text called, quote, "Safely Beyond the Limits of the United States, the Mormon Expulsion and U.S. Expansion," end of quote. Listen to what Professor Dirkmaat says.
They come to be seen as this enemy group that is at odds with the United States, and they see themselves at odds with the United States to the point where they see true safety in getting outside of U.S. control. Farmers in Oregon want the United States to annex Oregon to make it a part of the United States. Latter-day Saints, on the other hand, are deliberately and desperately trying to get out of the United States. They want to go somewhere that the U.S. is not.
In today's episode of Why Religion, get ready to flee the U.S. with the early Latter-day Saints and better understand why they did so and why, when they arrived in the Rocky Mountains, they found themselves right back in American territory working with the U.S. government all over again. It is a fascinating history full of applicable lessons for us today. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Ryan Sharp from BYU's Religious Education sat down with his colleague, Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat, to discuss Dr. Dirkmaat's recent publication on the Latter-day Saint expulsion and exodus from the United States. In part one, Professor Dirkmaat gives some fascinating history, weaving a wonderful historical narrative to frame the situation. In part two, like normal, he gets into some great application, talking about things like having empathy towards discriminated against minority groups and the battle of politics over religious beliefs and where we place our priorities. And in part three, like usual, he will tell us a little bit more about his own academic journey that brought him to BYU and about his own faith. Here then is Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat being interviewed by Ryan Sharp.
So today we're discussing a chapter you published in a book entitled Inventing Destiny, The Cultural Explorations of U.S. Expansion. And the title of the chapter we're discussing today is Safely Beyond the Limits of the United States, the Mormon Expulsion and U.S. Expansion. I do want to set it up with an excerpt from your chapter. And so this is what you say towards the end of the chapter. John Taylor, an apostle who had witnessed the murders of Joseph and Hyrum Smith a year earlier, and whose body bore the scars of multiple bullet wounds received at the Carthage jail, similarly had enough of the United States. He had seen the Smiths murdered under the auspices of the law that was either so corrupt it refused to protect them, or so inept it simply could not protect them. In frustration, he said, in regard to the situation of the world as it now exists, I don't care a damn because they are as corrupt as the devil. We have no benefit from the laws of the land, and the only reason why they don't cut our throats is because they dare not. Responding to the concern that a more strident relationship with the United States might cause even greater persecution, Taylor scoffed, "They cannot lie about us nor persecute us worse than they've done." For Taylor, U.S. democracy had proved to be a failure. The government was too easily corrupted, especially on a local level, and the rights of minorities were rarely protected and defended by the states or the federal government. Taylor explained, and this is the last part, "We know we have no more justice here than we could get at the gates of hell, and the only thing we have got to do is to take care of ourselves," unquote. All right, I know that was lengthy. My question to you, and now I'm just going to let you take it whatever direction you want. How in the world did we get here? How did we get to this point?
Yeah, it's the culmination of frustration. You can feel the frustration of John Taylor there, and as I wrote, John Taylor is someone for whom persecution at the hands of the United States or people living in the United States, or at the very least the lack of intervention by the authorities of the United States to prevent that, it's not a theory to him, and really it's not a theory to most of the Latter-day Saints. I mean, we're talking about people who experienced the extermination order and the expulsion in Missouri. The idea that government troops might not just be not protecting you from mob violence, but they might be the perpetrators of it at places like Haun's Mill and Far West. This isn't a theory to Latter-day Saints. And so in some ways, part of what's going on is the mentality of Latter-day Saints has been forever scarred by those events, by the events of, it's one thing when the government refuses to intervene on your behalf. That's what you have in the early days in Missouri. In 1833, you have mob violence that destroys, Latter-day Saint property, their printing press. By the end of the year, you have people that are being killed over this. Their lands are stolen from them, and you have these local state authorities utterly refusing to give these legally purchased lands back. Just essentially like, well, I guess stop being Latter-day Saints, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. I mean, and that's the beginning point of this kind of this apathetic government. But what you have by the end of the time in Missouri is not, unfortunately, not an apathetic government. Instead of a government that's not willing to defend you, you have a government that is actively taking steps against you. And you have the same thing kind of beginning to form in Illinois. I think for the Latter-day Saints, as rhetoric about expulsion and annihilation started to gain more and more credence in Illinois newspapers, to you and I, we can look back on that and say, well, I mean, I know he says they need to be exterminated, but he doesn't really mean that. Well, if you're a Latter-day Saint who's had 3 or 4 houses burned down, and people in your family murdered, you take those threats really seriously.
Let me jump in and read an excerpt from this part of the story. So internal schisms and external political and economic frustrations combined to make a stew toxic to Mormon peace. By early 1844, anti-Mormon antagonism was so palpable that even the most hostile newspaper from nearby Warsaw, Illinois, remarked with at least feigned concern, quote, "We see no use in attempting to disguise the fact that many in our midst contemplate a total extermination of that people, that the tens of thousands of defenseless women and children, aged and infirm, who are congregated at Nauvoo must be driven out, driven, scattered, like the leaves before the autumn blast," unquote. So this is the period of time we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. This is that late period. So you have a couple things that are going on. Why is it all coming to a head? Well, a lot of it has to do with politics, national politics. I mean, I want all your listeners to fall asleep, so I'm going to talk about 19th century American politics. So when you wake up 10 minutes from now, then you'll know what happened. But Joseph Smith is increasingly frustrated that the existing systems of government in the United States are either too weak to help the saints or too cowardly to help the saints. And this really hits the culmination when he goes and visits President Martin Van Buren in 1840. And, whatever Martin Van Buren says, we've got various accounts of what he says, your cause is just, I can do nothing for you. Whatever he actually says, we know what actually happens. And that is nothing. That the federal government is not going to intervene at all. The saints have had thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property stolen from them in Missouri.
And people have been murdered, innocent.
Dozens of people killed, wounded, murdered, assaulted, and nobody is even charged for any of this. This is not even a question of, we didn't get the justice we thought we'd want. These aren't even considered crimes. There's no remuneration at all for their property. And so Joseph, they petition the Congress. They, of course, petition the Missouri courts who don't care at all. So at that point, those wheels really start to turn for Joseph. And so in 1843, it's kind of an open election. The 1844 election's coming. They don't have a primary system the same way we do. And so, the reality is you can, you don't really know who's going to stand. And on the Democratic side, there were lots of people that were going to run. Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the former vice president of the United States, was reported to be running. Lewis Cass, who was a former Secretary of War and governor of Michigan, was reported to be running. John C. Calhoun, former vice president of the United States, big-time firebrand, pro-slavery advocate. And Joseph writes letters to all these guys and says, are you going to do anything for us if you're elected? Now, remember, the Latter-day Saints have been reliable Democratic voters since Ohio. And so I think that there's probably a little bit of a sense of, look, we're voting for you. Are you going to do anything for us? And the ones that do respond, they all respond and say, no, there's nothing. I couldn't possibly pledge myself to help you. Well, on the other side of the ledger, the other party at the time was the Whig Party. It sounds like the worst named party ever to your 21st century. I mean, if I were going to start a political party today, I wouldn't call it, the Hair Club for Men Party, but the Whig Party, it has its origins in this idea of being opposed to Andrew Jackson when he was president. The Whigs were opposed to the king and his power, the opposition to the monarchical power in England. So they take that terminology. But their leader, Henry Clay, the famous statesman, almost everyone thinks he's going to win the nomination. And Joseph has, by 1843, decided, you know what? Forget the Democrats. They won't help us at all. There's talk that even Martin Van Buren is going to become president again. So that's not, clearly he's not willing to help us. And so he even gives an interview when he says, he's supporting Henry Clay. And much to the chagrin of some, Democrats who thought, these Latter-day Saints, they're reliable Democratic voters. Well, Henry Clay also writes Joseph back and says, I feel really bad about what happened to you guys, but, I couldn't possibly. And so really they're faced with this reality. No matter who becomes president, they're already on record saying, I'm not going to help you. You have like the newspaper article you just read, you have increasing sentiment that is violent in nature, that is claiming we need to exterminate these people, we need to drive them out. And if you're a Latter-day Saint and you've lived through Hans Mill, you're not going to just sit there and say, well, I'm sure they won't actually kill people, because they've actually done it before. And so Joseph makes a couple of decisions. The first is he will run himself as president of the United States. And it'll be a very radical platform that he'll put out there. Not because he thinks he's going to win, but in order to provide an alternative for people to vote for and to draw attention to what he sees as the deficiencies in the Constitution and in the way minorities are treated in their rights. But that's not the long-term goal. The long-term is we're just going to have to get out. It seems like he has come to this conclusion. We are going to have to leave the United States, and we're going to have to go somewhere else. Anywhere, we've tried a lot of places here, New York, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois. Anywhere we go, we're a minority and we're a hated minority. And whether that reason is because of politics or religion or economics doesn't even really matter. It will always be more politically expedient to hate us than it will be to side with us. And so we've got to go. And so that's the real long-term plan is we need to find a place to go, to get out of it. And that's what a lot of the article talks about is their desperate attempts to find a place outside of U.S. control.
And at this point in the story, I want to interrupt again, because really this is a part of the story that hasn't been told very often in the past. In fact, kind of pre-2017 with the release of the Council of 50 Minutes and such, we didn't have access to this. So maybe give us a brief intro to the Council of 50, what it was, and how it aligned with what you're talking about right now.
The Council of 50 is just this amazing document. I mean, honestly, if you are only going to read one volume of the Joseph Smith papers, you think, well, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read one of those. I've got a bunch of them sitting on my shelf. The Council of 50 would probably be the most fascinating to you. And so what it is in March of 1844, because of questions asked by a group of people logging up in Wisconsin for the temple about this idea of going somewhere else, Joseph forms this council. It ends up having 50 people in it, and that's why it gets called the Council of 50. The primary purpose of this council is to do a couple of things. One, the minor thing is it's going to help with the Joseph Smith election campaign. But the primary purpose is to find a place to go and establish the kingdom of God on earth. That they're going to leave Nauvoo, and where are they going to go? And so they go so far as, they're examining all these different places they could go and sending
which
people.
By the way, the top 3 or 4 are...
So there are several that they discuss. They, for instance, discuss going to Oregon Territory. At the time, Oregon Territory, it included everything from what is today southern Oregon all the way up to the top of Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada. The British and the United States jointly occupied all of that area. There was only about 5,000 people living in that entire area. And by there were only 5,000 whites living there. There's obviously tens of thousands of Native Americans, but neither the British or the Americans are counting them, right? So that area is jointly occupied, meaning its final status is not really determined. And in fact, the arguments over that status will nearly lead to war between the United States and Great Britain in 1845. So it's a big issue. So they talk about going there, but it's not as the reality is that this is still under some U.S. control. And so the places they really talk about going are Texas and California. And when I say California, I don't mean, just, the land of milk and honey that you all think of today when you think of San Diego and the beautiful Bay of San Francisco. Back then, the entirety of California, Nevada, Utah, half of Colorado, part of Wyoming, most of Arizona, all of that was called Alta California as far as a part of Mexico. And it had almost no white inhabitants. I mean, that entire area that I just listed off has fewer than 7,000 non-Native Americans in it. And the largest city in that area is Los Angeles, has 1,200 people. Well, Nauvoo's got, pushing at least, with the surrounding areas, as many as 20,000 people. Anywhere the Latter-day Saints go,
they become the majority.
Yeah, anywhere they go in Mexican California. So on a map, Mexico controls Utah, right? There's not Mexican Garrison 1 in the place that will become Utah, right? There are occasional slave raiders and fur trappers that are trading out of Taos, New Mexico, and for Mexico, but there's no actual control of the area. Native Americans control the area. There's no military. Yeah, yes, there was, the Dominguez Escalante expedition that went and looked at it. That's not the same thing as actually controlling it.
And in fact, doesn't Brigham Young in there in your article, you said he's essentially concluding we'll be better off among the Lamanites than we would here in U.S. territory.
And in fact, many of the people in the council conclude that here we can't get any safety. And part of that is they believe theologically too that the Native Americans are going to they're going to convert, that they because they're part of the scattered tribes of Israel, that they're going to hear the gospel message, and so they're actually anxious to settle among them, and they've had relatively good experiences with them. It is not lost on them that Native Americans are being treated badly by these other forces as well. I mean, obviously, when the Saints actually come to Utah, there's going to be conflicts between Native Americans and white settlers because over land and territory and areas. But at least as they're contemplating this, they're thinking we'd be better off among the Native Americans. But one of the most attractive things is the fact that almost no one lives there, right? So anywhere we go, we'll go establish our own kingdom. We'll go where no one else lives, and we will. Then if people come, then it's their fault. We're not invading you and changing your policies and changing your government. We're going to go create our own kingdom. It's completely separate from the United States, from Mexico, from everybody. And then we'll be safe. So the last place that they actually really look into the most is actually Texas. At the time, the Republic of Texas is independent of Mexico. It's won its independence, remember the Alamo and whatnot. And while it's independent, Texas is in a pretty precarious situation. Mexico is, 100 times more populous than Texas, has a very large and professional European-style army because that's how the Mexican presidents are able to maintain power. And Texas is this vast area with very few people actually living in it, fewer than 100,000, living in all of what, the same borders of Texas that you'd think of today. Well, the Latter-day Saints are considering going there. And they send emissaries. The Council of 50 sends emissaries down to go negotiate with President Sam Houston, who's the president of the Republic of Texas.
And sorry, this is still while Joseph's alive.
Joseph's alive. Yep, Joseph's alive.
Because he's going to die in June, and we're in March,
April. We're sending him down to go meet with him. Now, that's the attractive aspect of Texas, is it's a separate country. It's not the United States. And instead of having a president saying, your cause is just, I can do nothing for you, you have Sam Houston saying, come down. I'll give you a bunch of land. I'll make sure that you're protected. And in a letter he writes to one prominent Latter-day Saint, he says, you should come down. I am no bigot, basically saying that he's going to allow them to practice their religion. What eventually ends the Texas plan, and they're really, I think that had things gone differently, this might be BYU, Texas. The reality is the plan was to go to Texas, I think. And then Texas got annexed by the United States. Once Texas became part of the United States, the Council of 50 immediately drops talking about it. The whole point is to get out. So even though Sam Houston is still in charge in Texas, you still have a favorable government official there. I think for the Latter-day Saints, Thomas Ford was once a favorable government official.
Wasn't it Brigham Young's son that said it's still within the? Yeah,
it's his brother. Yeah, it says it's still within it's within the United States. He's actually talking in that case because another place they look is the Cherokee land. They look at the Native American lands as well, and they actually send emissaries to go negotiate with Native Americans. And some of the Native Americans say absolutely. The American Indians say you can come and settle here. They're negotiating that ability. But technically, even those unorganized Indian lands are still technically part of the Louisiana Purchase. They're still technically part of U.S. territory, whereas Texas is not. Texas is a separate republic. Mexican California, Alta California, is another country. It is outside of the realm of the United States, and so the idea, you can really see this push, especially after Joseph is murdered, because Texas is annexed after Joseph is murdered. Especially after Joseph's murdered, the reality is we have got to get out of here. We can't go to just another state in the Union. If we go to another state, the same thing's going to happen that's happened in every other state.
So finally, the decision is made. We've got to get out of here. Let's wait until spring. So maybe just tell our listeners, what is it that expedites that?
Yeah, so Joseph Smith is murdered in June of 1844. This is the 177th anniversary of Joseph's murder. And so as they pick up the pieces from that, obviously there's a bunch of shock. And, eventually, once Brigham Young consolidates power, he intends to do exactly what Joseph Smith intended to do. And Joseph Smith had made it very clear that they were going to leave and go somewhere else. And Brigham Young intends to leave and go somewhere else. And that's only highlighted by the fact that Joseph and Hiram have been murdered. And what has happened to those murderers? Nothing, right? And in fact, by late 1845, you have roving mobs who are going to outlying Mormon settlements and burning them down. You have Edmund Durfee, who's murdered at the Yell Rome settlement, who's just murdered by these mobs, and his house is burned down. And it's starting to look very similar to what Missouri looked like at the height of its violence.
And this is where John Taylor's comments come in.
Yeah, and this is why John Taylor he's really got no use for it. The other thing that's happened is that Illinois has revoked the Nauvoo Charter. So by January of 1845, the largest city by some accounts, it's either as large or slightly larger than Chicago, maybe slightly smaller than Chicago. At any rate, it's either the largest or the second largest urban area in the entire state is disincorporated as a city. It's now all unincorporated Hancock County. So they no longer have municipal officials. They no longer have a municipal court system. They no longer have a police force. They have no ability to collect taxes. They are dispossessed of those political rights. And all of those things just build on one another. And you get to where John Taylor is saying, this is your American freedom, essentially. This is your democracy, that people can be murdered at will, that no one's brought to justice, that people can have their houses burned down. And you tell me, hey, don't talk out about it too much, or they might get more mad. Well, how can they get more mad? They're already killing us. They're already doing this. And to the point that the question you asked, they settle on going to Mexican California. And that's their plan. They don't know exactly where they're going to go, but they've got some maps, and they're working on maybe at the Bear River Valley, and maybe, just as one point is made in the Council of 50 Minutes, it needs to be on the other side of the mountains. We need to be on the other side of the Rocky Mountains.
Because they see this as protection.
Yeah, because it's not easy to get through the Rocky Mountains. And if they start coming, we'll see them coming, and we can protect ourselves. We can defend ourselves there. And plus, again, it has the advantage of there's no other permanent settlements there. Yeah, there's some occasional fur traders and trappers and things like that, but there's no permanent settlement that's intended to be there long-term. Outside, again, of the American Indians, of course. The Utes have many settlements, but they, like most Americans, aren't thinking in those terms. So they actually negotiate with the governor, right? That they tell them, look, we're planning to leave. We're going to leave. Governor Ford, in order to hasten their removal, he writes, decides that he's not going to wait until April or May. You you might wonder, you see, the paintings of the saints crossing a frozen river, to the other side of Iowa. You hear of the horror stories of them trying to cross Iowa, in the winter and in the early spring, and the roads are all muddy. And you might say to yourself, well, why didn't they, I don't know, wait until spring, and then you wouldn't be out in the winter, and then you wouldn't be in a muddy road. You could just travel across Iowa in the summer and you'd be fine. Well, they leave earlier than they expect because Governor Ford deliberately deceives them. And
he lies, right? He makes a story up.
I don't know how, whatever your thoughts are about Governor Ford, those people listening. I mean, I doubt that very many people listening to this, have Governor Ford, in a high place of honor, at their table. But there's a lot of theories and conjecture about how culpable Thomas Ford is for the murder of Joseph Smith, to the point where some people even theorize, well, I think that he actually planned it and he deliberately left so that the murder could take place. We don't have evidence of that. I'm not saying I believe that. But there are arguments of how culpable Thomas Ford is for the death of Joseph Smith. I mean, he's at least culpable in the sense that he says he demands Joseph goes to Carthage and says he will protect him, and Joseph's dead. So regardless of he's at least culpable in the sense of ineptitude. But in this case, you don't even have to speculate on whether or not Thomas Ford is a liar. And the reason why you don't have to is that Thomas Ford brags about being a liar. He's very impressed with himself. When he writes his book, he says, with a view to hasten their removal, they were made to think that a regular army was coming up from St. Louis that was going to arrest their leaders and stop them from fleeing to another country. And he deliberately does this. He writes to Sheriff Backenstoss, who's a non-Latter-day Saint, but pro-Latter-day Saint sheriff of Hancock County, knowing that it'll get to Brigham Young, saying, hey, yeah, that army's on its way. I mean, if you guys are still there, they're only waiting for the ice to break up in the river, and then they're coming up. And then what's going to happen? And this is, it's taken as a real threat. And in fact, Brigham Young's also hearing from other people in D.C. that people like the Secretary of War are saying things like, it won't do to let the Latter-day Saints, to let the Mormons is what they call them, let the Mormons go to Mexico or to California, but that they must be obliterated from off the face of the earth. Well, again, if you're someone who's gone through the violence of Missouri and the extermination order, when you hear someone saying the Secretary of War says you need to be obliterated, and then the next thing you hear is, by the way, an army's en route, you take it seriously. And the Latter-day Saints take it so seriously that we all know the calling of the Mormon Battalion. Well, when that Mormon Battalion calling, when that first happens, when Captain Allen and those troops first ride over the hill and they in Mount Pisgah and they see these soldiers coming, people run screaming because they think this is the army that was coming to kill us. I mean, now they learn later that that's not what's going on, but there is this palpable fear. They're driven from the nation from that fear. And Thomas Ford deliberately lies about it. In fact, the worst part about it, I mean, I know everyone's asleep, but the worst part about this is, if you could wake up for just a second, the worst part about this is not only was there not an army coming, if an army had been coming, it would have been because Ford himself had requested it. He sends a secret letter through the senator of Illinois to James Polk requesting federal intervention against the Mormons. James Polk, in one of the few instances of American politicians ever doing what's actually right, says, well, I can't interfere with the Mormons on the basis of their religious beliefs. If I could do that to Mormons, then I could with Baptists. And what? So not only is no army coming, if an army was coming, it would have been because Ford requested it. And C, he knew that it wasn't coming. It wasn't even a possibility of it coming. The president had said, I'm not sending an army to do that. Well, Ford's lies cost the lives of hundreds and hundreds of Latter-day Saints who leave Nauvoo before they're ready, who are more exposed to the elements, who don't have all the supplies they would have otherwise. And that's it's a black mark on, if not the escutcheon of Illinois, certainly of Thomas Ford. And you can see why, if what you're hearing, John Taylor, is rhetoric that the federal government's going to obliterate you, rhetoric that an army is en route to destroy you, rhetoric from local newspapers that you need to be exterminated, Joseph and Hiram are murdered and you're filled with your own bullet holes from that experience, you can see why at that point he said, I've had enough of this. Thank you for all your wonderful democracy. It's done such a great job. We're going to leave and we're going to go somewhere else.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place for you to check out. Since we've been talking about America in this episode, there's a great book that I want to bring your attention to that was released this past year that is a combination of research articles by BYU church history and doctrine professors. It's called Latter-day Saints in Washington, D.C. This volume takes a fresh look at the history, people, and places in Washington, D.C. that have affected the church. Beginning with Joseph Smith's earliest interactions with the federal government in the 1830s, the church's progress has been shaped by leaders and members interacting in Washington. This volume is filled with about 24 essays on a variety of topics about the church's history, people, and places in the nation's capital. It also chronicles many of the saints and statesmen who have worked to bring the church out of obscurity and onto a national and international stage. Again, the book is called Latter-day Saints in Washington, D.C. History, People, and Places. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Professor Gerrit Dirkmaat talk about his recent publication, Safely Beyond the Limits of the United States, The Mormon Expulsion and U.S. Expansion, published in the book Inventing Destiny, Cultural Explorations of U.S. Expansion by the University Press of Kansas. In part 2 of Why Religion, we like to get a little bit more into specific applications related to the publication for the everyday saint. How can it help us in living, learning, and loving the restored gospel? We pick up here with Professor Dirkmaat, giving some really great insights into how this history might apply to us right now, today.
I know your primary audience for this article was not necessarily members of the church. However, what do you hope we would learn from this? Like, why would this matter to our listeners?
Wow. I'm not, I don't know that I'm the right person in a position to say what every person should get out of it, but I think there's a couple of things. One, that as Latter-day Saints, we should be incredibly attuned to the sufferings of hated minority groups, right? Whether it is a religious or a racial or an ethnic persecution, whether it's people saying, well, everywhere they go, they don't get along, and that kind of, a Latter-day Saint should be pretty attuned to that because our history is one of rejection. Second, that these people made a decision that their religion, their religious beliefs were more important than their national identity. Nationalism gave way to their religion, that if they had to choose between what their political leaders had to say and what their God had to say, it isn't even close, right? That, and really, it's part of the reason why you find Latter-day Saints, when they came to Utah, by the time you got to Utah, if you're among these early settlers, there aren't a whole lot of casual Mormons anymore, right? You're not, casual Mormon was 2,000 miles and 4 burned down houses ago, right? I mean, if you're following Brigham Young into the middle of this, for lack of a better term, I apologize to everyone from Utah, but into the middle of this godforsaken desert, right? Where there's it does not look like it's going to be fertile, does not look like it's going to have very much access to fresh water, lots of salt water, but not fresh water. If you're walking into that dry, dusty 100-degree valley,
you're already all in.
If you've gotten that far, you've walked over the mountains and you see it, yeah, all right. It's because you believe. And so that hopefully what we can take out of the exodus from the United States is that at times we will be forced to choose between what we believe and what is comfortable and what is fashionable and what is politically what we want to believe politically, and that's exactly what our Latter-day Saint forebears, what they had to decide. They had to make a decision to essentially leave the country that many of them loved, in order to go try to create a place where they could be safe. And it's important that people understand that, because otherwise they might think that the only conflict between Latter-day Saints in the 19th century and the American culture that surrounds them is just surrounding plural marriage. I mean, people are being butchered in Hans Mill before anyone's practicing plural marriage, right? It's an easy after the fact scapegoat. But the reality is the problems run far deeper than that. And, it is with great difficulty that Latter-day Saints stake out their religious freedom. And I think the reason why members of the church today so desperately cling to religious freedom, and so they so desperately see the importance of religious freedom, because they've experienced what it's like, or at least historically, what it's like to not have it.
I think that's such beautiful application. Let me ask, it might seem like an odd and unrelated question, and it's certainly beyond the scope of what you did with this piece, but I'm curious, here we are, 2021, we collectively as members of the church, we're a fairly patriotic bunch who really are committed to democracy. So how in the world do we, from 1845, where your article ends, to now where we're at in 2021, we're walking away from democracy in 1845 and walking away from the United States. And now, those Americans who are listening today, I mean, we are deeply committed to what the United States has to offer. How did we get to this point?
Well,
I realize it's an unfair, completely unfair question.
Yeah, hey, this is outside the scope of your research and 150 more years of history. But
why don't you just give us your thoughts on this?
Anyway. That's I think people have come to expect those kind of gotcha questions from you, Ryan. Let me first off start off by the fact that the problems don't end there, right? So because of the anti-polygamy controversy and the difficulties of becoming a state, the Latter-day Saints are not going to stop seeing the United States government as their enemy when Utah becomes a territory. I mean, the government is trying to pass laws to make parts of their religion illegal, and it's not just anti-polygamy laws. I mean, when you're passing laws saying Mormons can't serve on juries when 90% of the population are Mormons, well, that's a pretty big problem, right? When you're allowing places like Idaho to become a state in 1890 with an express provision in their constitution that Mormons are not allowed to have voting rights, you can see why all the way up to the end of the 19th century, Latter-day Saints have a very negative interaction with the United States government. And, it is certainly schizophrenic in the sense that most of them are Americans. They are part of the United States. They have these American ideals and values. They certainly love the American Constitution, but it's the American government that's actually passing anti-Mormon laws and causing these problems. So obviously the first answer to the question is the easiest one, and that, we stop practicing polygamy, right? So as that comes to be the symbol of Mormon recalcitrance and Latter-day Saints can't be considered real Americans because they're violating the law, right? Once that's ebbed, once Utah becomes a state, the natural process of assimilation starts to happen more and more and more. The railroad certainly helps with that. You're now more connected. Telegraph, and then eventually telephone and radio, and the culture that all Latter-day Saints in Utah are imbibing is all of this American culture. And, there are unifiers in American culture, like baseball, that a Latter-day Saint is sitting listening to his little transistor radio of Babe Ruth knocking home runs out the same way someone in New Jersey is, right? So over the course of time, there's just the natural assimilation that's going on as part of it. And I think the other part of it, and obviously there are greater experts on this than me. Really, there's greater experts on everything than me. But the one of the things that really changes and transforms for Latter-day Saints is the rise of international communism. When the Spanish-American War happens, this is 1898. There's a real discussion about whether or not the Latter-day Saints should support the government in this, because they're still being persecuted by this government. But by World War I, which has this kind of unifying effect, with World War II especially, and then the Cold War that follows it, not only do you have decades that have passed since the United States has been overtly the enemy, you also have shared ideals now, and not just American ideals of apple pie and baseball, but the Latter-day Saints see international communism as a real threat. It's atheistic and godless, and takes away human agency, and very importantly prevents missionary proselyting, right? It prevents the gospel from being shared. And the United States government is now the primary opponent of international communism. And so I think that has a big part of it. So time, certainly, distance away from all of these things, the natural assimilation that happens in societies when people have lived in them a long time, technological advances, cultural experiences, but then also by the late 1940s, the biggest enemy of the church and the biggest enemy of the United States, they're the same thing. At least they appear to be the same thing. And so that really kind of breeds this kind of being a good Mormon and being opposed to communism. They're the same thing. And who's more opposed to communism than the United States?
If you're interested in Dr. Gerrit Dirkmaat's research on the Latter-day Saint expulsion and exodus from the U.S., we've included a link to the book where his article has been published on our website, whyreligion.byu.edu. We've also included there, by the way, on our website, a link to get the digital content for free of a great book that's called The Council of 50, What the Records Reveal About Mormon History, published by the Religious Studies Center. It's full of fascinating articles in that book that deal with a lot of the themes addressed in this podcast episode. And one more time, if you love the show but haven't yet left us a review on your podcast platform, please do so, as it helps in the promoting algorithms so that others who might enjoy this podcast but haven't yet found it can be exposed to it. And remember, if you're an Instagrammer, give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast to get quotes and comment on new episodes and be part of the Why Religion community. All right, we've arrived at the last part of Why Religion, where we like to talk a little bit more personally about the professor's own academic journey and own faith. So we conclude here with Gerrit Dirkmaat letting us know a little bit about why he chose to become a religious educator at Brigham Young University and why he chooses faith in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.
For this last segment, we want to shift gears a little bit more here and talk about you. So talk to us about your academic training. Where did you study? What did you study? Why did you choose that? Kind of walk us through your training.
I see why you asked this at the end, because if you ask at the beginning, then no one listens to the rest of it, right? Like, what if they don't want to hear what that is? But I went to Utah State for I got my undergraduate in history, and then I got my PhD in American history, 19th century American history at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I never intended to do church history. In fact, I was planning on doing military history. I was the editor of Diplomatic History, which is a scholarly journal that's published out of the University of Colorado. So I was doing a lot of diplomatic history. And in researching one of my papers, I was researching through the official records of the rebellion. And these are the records of the Civil War. I came across a a Union leader asking for more troops so he could essentially, annihilate the traitors in his midst. And it piqued my interest that this is not, some Union general in an occupied Louisiana parish. This was the Union Colonel Patrick Connor occupying Utah during the American Civil War. And he sees these Latter-day Saints as absolutely traitors, as enemies. So even though Utah had not seceded from the United States, he saw them as traitors and as enemies. And that made me do, some research on that. So I eventually wrote my dissertation on the Latter-day Saint relations with the federal government from the late Joseph Smith period to the early Brigham Young period, and the way that they're essentially treated as a foreign entity by both Americans and the federal government. Well, so I had some chapters on Joseph Smith in there, and this is why I think when that opportunity presented itself, I was hired by the Joseph Smith Papers Project at the Church History Library to work on those volumes. I worked on multiple volumes while I was there, and then eventually came down to BYU. I've been here for this is my 7th year here. I still continued to work on Joseph Smith Papers volumes when I was here as a volunteer, including the Council 50 minutes. And so that's how I ended up where I'm at. I never intended to be a religious educator. I guess if anyone's ever taken my class, they're like, yeah, it shows. But I'm very grateful for where I am at. I'm grateful for the trajectory that I ended up at. But it was not something that I ever anticipated.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful. One of the last questions that we like to ask is, what is it that roots you in the restoration? I mean, it comes out in all conversations that I've had with you, that I've heard with you, and certainly even talking about these historical issues. What is it that roots you and grounds your faith in the restoration of the gospel?
Man, that's a really big question. I feel like anything I say will be inadequate. Fundamentally, I believe with all my heart that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. And I, because of working with the Joseph Smith Papers, because it's been essentially my job for the past 2 decades in one form or another, of researching and writing about it, I've come to know Joseph Smith and other early church leaders in a way that I think most people don't have the opportunity to. I mean, most people can't just sit around all day and read every letter that Joseph Smith wrote. I mean, it's great work if you can get it, right? And so I having had that kind of exposure to those things, to his teachings, to his personal nature, to his public nature, private writings, public letters, public sermons, minutes of meetings that he's in, it is just all the more evident to me that this is a man who was called by God to be a prophet and to reveal the most beautiful doctrines that exist. I think that I understand why people have questions, especially when it comes to questions about history. History's messy. We don't have sources for every single thing. We have little teeny snapshots of the littlest things, and we try to build giant things out of them. We can only work with what we actually have. And sometimes there are questions about history that we don't have answers to. There's questions about theology we don't have answers to. But it's not just Joseph the man knowing that he saw God. It's the revelations that he gives. The fact that I don't believe, because of Joseph Smith and the revelations through him, that I don't believe that most people are going to be burning in an eternal hell forever. I believe, with very few exceptions, people are all going to go to some kingdom of heaven after they've suffered for their sins. The idea that there's an eternal family, that there's eternal marriage, the ideas that everyone will have an equal opportunity to be saved. Those are all beautiful ideas, all coming from Joseph, and the idea of a pre-existent life, and that I'm something more than just, the bag of flesh and bone that you see here. That however imperfect I am in this mortality, the reality is I'm actually an eternal being that is one day going to be something better than I am. That there are so many aspects of that come out in Joseph Smith's teachings as well. His loving nature, his forgiving nature, and his desperate desire to see other people be happy. There's so many aspects of it for me. And so I would say, I know that there are things that we don't have all the answers to. And sometimes because we don't have all the answers to them, it causes us to feel uncomfortable. It causes us to question. It causes us to say, well, if I don't know exactly how, marriage works in the next life, then maybe I don't want to believe any of this. I hope that we'll stop and take the time to realize that many of the questions we even have are because Joseph Smith was a prophet. The only reason I'm wondering how my great-grandmother's ceiling works is because Joseph Smith said that ceilings actually exist. There aren't any Presbyterians asking who great-grandma's married to of the three men that she was married to in this life, because the answer is nobody, right? The only person who is asking that question is a Latter-day Saint who, because of Joseph Smith's teachings, believe that there's even a possibility of eternal life and eternal marriage. So I think that my firm belief that Joseph Smith saw God, that Jesus lives because I know Joseph saw him, that Jesus' atonement is going to make up the difference for our sins and our failings. I don't think that I could have, I don't know that I could function without those beliefs, because they're so central to me. I had my brother die earlier this year. Suddenly, out of nowhere. I mean, he's only 37 years old. And not, of a physical malady that, he knew that there was something wrong with him. And before he could even get into a doctor to get checked, he died. Leaving two little kids under the age of 2 at home. And it's a tragedy, and it's awful, and those kids are going to suffer not being with my brother in this life, and his wife's going through this terrible trauma. And this life is hard and unfair. And yet, because of Joseph Smith, I know that the idea of a resurrection is not just what some people 2,000 years ago wrote about Jesus. Because Joseph Smith saw Jesus multiple times since that time, and Joseph taught that all of our losses, all of them, are going to be made up to us in the next life. So however unfair this is, somehow, in a way we don't understand, and in a way that we don't know how it will happen, God is going to make everything up to us. So sorry, I probably talked way too long. I don't know. You ask a question I don't know the answer to. There's too many things for the reason why I believe, but I believe.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from BYU Religious Education, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.